On to the nightcap in the national semifinal. We have, as Jordan mentioned, Alabama and Purdue. And by the way, if you want to get down with us on any of these bets over at BetMGM Sportsbook, you could use promo code THELINES, one word, to get $150 in bonus bets with your first $5 bet. Terms and conditions apply over at thelines.com. And you can find all of our bets from our staff members in our free Discord channel. Link is at thelines.com in the top right-hand corner. Now, UConn, an 11.5 point favorite. There is a 12 out there, but pretty much consensus 11.5. Total of 160.5. Eric, I want to go back to last night with you, and not with you in particular. You weren't trying to get on the plane with Dan Hurley and the UConn Huskies, at least to my knowledge, trying to get over to Phoenix. But what were you thinking when that was going on? Because even Dan Hurley tweeted something, that was kind of snarky. And I'm just like, why? I get why all the coverage is being paid attention to the Huskies in that situation. But at the same time, just stop.
Yeah. First world problems. I look at this and go, come on, guys. I mean, I know this is very common that we see from our media nowadays. They're trying to make something out of nothing. They're trying to show, the outrage of, oh my God, they got Uncrustables and crackers and that's all they could eat. They made it sound like they were in a North Korean prison camp for a good month and a half. It's not that way at all. I mean, these guys are, I just talked to before about, how'd you like being Mohamed Diarra right now going through a Ramadan and he can't eat after a certain hour of the day and he has to do that time after time, for a period of like a good month or something like that. So no, I think this is kind of a big nothing burger. I think this is just kind of a story. People want to, talk about something and it's not going to pan out to be anything at all. But of course, if UConn comes out and plays a bad game or something and they come out slow, everybody's going to point and say, well, that was the reason why, because they lost all that sleep. Hey, you know what? Airplanes are comfortable. You can get comfortable. You can spread out probably. They can sleep on a plane. I'm sure it's not going to be a problem, but the media loves to talk about that kind of stuff.
Possibly orchestrated by Dan Hurley himself anyway.
Right.
To, get his LaBradford Smith moment in motivating somehow.
He's been talking, man. That's all we've been hearing about the last few weeks, trying to inspire. There was, I think, a video out with Colin Cowherd saying that he even comes up with made-up quotes from the opposing coaches just to fire his team up. Enough with this already. Did you have any other takes from the whole Axe hoopla last night?
No. I totally agree with Eric that it's just, something to talk about when there's nothing to talk about. Leading in the, few media, you've got all the media converging there at the same time, they have to talk about something. So.
Right.
That's
right.
It.
It's from national media. We as bettors aren't. Well, and it's actually a good segue because, it was not meant to be where, okay, there's a playing issue now, at least I don't think, where the spread dipped from 12 to 11.5 at some books. That was more so coincidental to my eyes last night and from my vantage point, where the line dipped a half point in UConn, Alabama. But there were some takes that were saying, okay, well, is UConn going to be potentially sleep deprived? And now they, after playing in Boston and on the East Coast for a couple straight weekends, now they have to deal with the time shift and maybe there's a little bit of jet lag, but I don't factor that into any of my handicapping, and I don't think either of you guys do. So Jordan, you tease this with the spread here at 11.5 consensus and a potential money line bet that kind of juxtapose one another, but two very likely outcomes that if one happens, if UConn dominates, X happens. If Alabama competes, X very well could happen better than what the implied probability shows. So dive into your two bets here.
Yeah. So, we've got a pretty good frame of reference game for this when Alabama played Purdue in Toronto, against a drop coverage with a big, massive center parked in the paint, patrolling it. And they shot, I think it was 46 threes, hit 19, had a decent second half lead against Purdue. So, I think Oates, he's even referenced it. He's not going to, kind of a slight dig at Underwood, I guess. He's not going to drive straight into Klingon. He's like, that would be stupid, right? you know, and so he's, I think going to go scorched earth here and just chuck up 53s. We might see Nelson at the 5, Stevenson at the 5, and just go completely 5 out. And, maybe Stevenson gets lucky again and hits 5 corner threes or whatever he did against Clemson. And, so in that scenario, I think Alabama certainly competes if they're winning a math equation, punting the rim defense, which they already stink at. So why not? And let UConn score at the rim, and then you take 53s. Hopefully you hit 20 of them or something wild, and you compete in the game this way. So I took Alabama money line for pennies, and then UConn, I took an alternate line, higher line, because then if those shots are missing, if they're shooting like, if their 5-out offense is shooting like Hawkins and Guerrier did in the Elite Eight, then all of a sudden UConn's pasting a triple kill shot on you, and the game's 25, 30 points within a matter of minutes. So I took that as well. So kind of both ends of the spectrum for me on that one.
And Eric, I know you don't have any bets per se on this game or looking to potentially wager or anything over the next couple of days, but how do you see things analytically?
Well, it's kind of interesting. You talked about the combined spread of these two games, of the UConn game and the Purdue game. Both teams, the raw numbers for me, have the favorites by 10.2 points, almost exactly. I think it's like 1/100th of a point off of the difference. But that differs from Vegas because Purdue's favored by 9, UConn by 11.5. And if you look at that, the reason why, it's largely because if you look at the UConn game, they actually have performed well away from home. Not to say that Alabama hasn't, but Alabama bolstered their numbers throughout the season because of their home record, because of their performances at home. Now that they're away from home, that works against them. That kind of balloons that spread. On top of that, the momentum rating goes in favor of UConn, largely because of the performance of Alabama coming into the tournament. If you go to the flip side of the, just kind of touching back on that Purdue game that we were talking about, the away from home rating works in favor of NC State. Again, Purdue wasn't necessarily bad at home, away from home. It's just that they were so good at home that it balloons their numbers a little bit more. So it made sense to me to see the spread go one way for one game and go the other way for the other one. Now, in this situation, coming back to the Alabama UConn game, I am trying to find any which way why I would not just bet on UConn to cover the spread, because the biggest X factor here, just looking at the curious trends at my site, the biggest difference maker when it comes to Alabama playing above or below their season norm is the team's success in the paint offensively and defensively. And you're looking at this and you say, well, take a look at the performance of UConn this year. 4th in the country in adjusted near proximity percentage. That's on offense. Defensively, number 1 in defensive near proximity percentage. On paper, Alabama should be nowhere near in this game. You see that it's a very polarizing metric, and you can look at those two metrics specifically and say, how does Alabama do against the good teams and how do they do against the bad teams? And it's for both of those metrics come right to the top of the list and saying these are the key factors that are going to cost Alabama in this game. So I look at this and we talked about what does Nate Oates try here? Jordan, you touched on it. Do they try to draw fouls? Illinois was fairly elite at getting to the foul line and a high free throw attempt rate. How did that work for them? Not too good. So are they going to try that kind of thing? Are they going to try to turn this into a track meet? What is the fastest team that UConn has faced, pace-wise this year? Maybe Xavier? I have them at 27th in the country. All of a sudden, you're playing Alabama, who is, for me, is 9th in the country in pace. If you look at those games against Xavier, Xavier lost by 5 at home against UConn, but then they got trounced by 43 at UConn a few weeks later. To Jordan's point, you could potentially have a close game, but all of a sudden, if you let it get out of control, all of a sudden this turns into a blowout. Just looking at that potential for a blowout as what you saw, obviously Alabama's not exactly Xavier, a better basketball team. But the fact is that those things on paper, especially on the interior, are working so much against Alabama in this game. I can't see how I can't pick UConn to cover this one.
Okay, so does that mean you're going to be adding the UConn minus 11?
I'm going to add UConn to cover in this one. Yes, actually, I didn't tell you about it, but the actual pick has already been made. 11.5. UConn to cover 11.5.
Okay, there we go. So we got 3 picks already in. And I want to take bits and pieces of what both of you guys have mentioned and expand upon it. Alabama away from home. I mentioned that in my write-up, Eric, over at thelines.com. Just kind of breaking things down here with how Alabama shot before the beginning of February. I think right around 38%. And between early February to mid-March, so before the NCAA tournament began, shooting right around 33%. And then now into the tournament, 4 games in, 40%. So that bleeds in perfectly to Jordan. And anybody could look at Alabama. You would think average college basketball bettor could look at Alabama and say, okay, high variance 3-point shooting team. But if they're on like they were at the beginning of the season and throughout this tournament, maybe we dig into the shooting backdrop as another potential variable here that could impact Mark Sears and the Crimson Tide shooting. But let's just say theoretically that they're on, then this game should be competitive. And your money line ticket may very well be live. But if they're off, we could see this game go south, and you guys will both probably cover, and especially you, Jordan, with your alternate spread getting pretty good plus money, I would think, on that. Now, an injury to keep in mind for Alabama. It seems like Latrell Wrightsell is going to be back. We don't know to what extent, but almost a full 2 weeks from suffering his second concussion against Grand Canyon. Best 3-point shooter statistically, one of their best, if not the best on-ball defender they have around the perimeter, generates his fair share of steals. So when we touched on this with NC State trying to generate extra possessions and maybe throwing in some ball pressure against Purdue that they haven't necessarily been doing, we'll see how Nate Oates decides to play it. But then if Alabama does go 5 out, right? I'm going to take your angle with the alternate spread, Jordan, and obviously your angle with the traditional spread, 11.5, Eric. If Alabama goes 5 out, more likely than not, you're not going to generate nearly as many second chance opportunities as they've gotten over the last 2 games. I think 31 combined offensive rebounds against UNC and Clemson, and they were able to do that with smaller guys on the floor. That's not going to be the case if Klingon's in the game. He's going to demolish the defensive glass if Alabama, maybe not with Stevenson, but if it's Nelson at the 5, definitely UConn will control the pace and control the defensive glass. And then, Jordan, you brought this up before I get to my player prop with transition defense for Alabama and just UConn and their ability to expose the opposition on the fast break. 1.22 points per possession in transition opportunities for the Huskies, one of the more efficient, hyper-efficient transition offenses in college basketball. They selectively run. And then I kind of combined this before the podcast and in my article, looking at when Alabama has faced up-tempo teams throughout the season, and they rank in the 2nd percentile when you combine games against Tennessee, Auburn, Kentucky, Florida, Arizona, Creighton. So things could very well go south. But if Alabama's hitting threes, I get why you want to throw a couple pennies on it. I'm not going to lay it with UConn, but I don't think I could get there, Jordan.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's like you mentioned, the offensive rebounding, those second chances. Maybe you can make a case that if they're chucking up 53s, a lot of them are going to be long rebounds where, Klingon's not patrolling. But then also those long rebounds tend to lead to transition runouts as well. And in the 5-out scenario, the main guy who has been dominating the offensive glass for Alabama is Pringle, and he's probably the guy you have to send to the pine if you want to play 5-out, of course. So, yeah, I mean, it's totally a valid point that, having any extra possessions is probably slim to none for Alabama.
Yeah, and Pringle is the only guy on the team that has over 2 offensive rebounds per game for Alabama. So, I mean, there's not going to be a ton of production there. They probably have to throw something a little bit of a curveball, and I don't know what that curveball is going to be for Nate Oates. He's got a plan. I don't know if that's reverse psychology he talked about today. If he just plans to completely all out abandon the interior game. That's going to be the question. Or if it sounds like he's going to abandon it, but then again, like I said, maybe it's a little bit of gamesmanship, and that he still plans to attack, because I think you can't quite go all in from 3 because if those shots aren't falling, it's going to be over quickly.
Well, yeah, that's to make like a football analogy. You can't completely abandon the run and then expect to just take shots downfield the entire game.
Right.
You got to have some like ability to. Otherwise, you can just park on the perimeter all night long, you know.
And maybe his goal is to get that in transition. Maybe he says, I gotta jack this up. I gotta play Paul Westhead kind of basketball, get up and down the court, and really, really press this. I don't know if he's capable of doing that, but I mean, he's got to come up with some sort of strategy, because if you follow, I mean, the fingerprint is very similar between Alabama and Illinois, and you just saw what Illinois tried to do, and it didn't work very well. So they got to try something a little bit different here.
Right. You know, like Nelson and Stevenson, they're not good 3-point shooters. So the whole plan is, if they're the 5-out guys, they actually have to hit those. And I referenced, you know, Carrier and Hawkins being the 5-out bigs for Illinois. They didn't hit the threes, you know. We saw what happened. Every one of their, you know, bricked threes led to a UConn transition run out during that 30-0 run. So, you know, like the idea of Stevenson and Nelson hitting, you know, 3, 4, 5 threes apiece is pretty outlandish. So, you know, like there really isn't a clear path at all for Alabama to compete in this game. But, you know, I'll throw a few pennies on the off chance that they do hit 23s or something insane.
And that's the thing too. If you look at the way UConn's defense is constructed, they want to run you off the 3-point line when it's in the half court, and then Underwood, I think what I've learned from this conversation and from Nate Oates' press conference earlier is that any one of us could have coached a better game and schemed up a better game plan than Brad Underwood last week in Boston. None of us had any idea what he was doing. I don't even think he knew what he was doing, even though he said to the sideline reporter, otherwise it gave a double down that they were going to.
That will live in infamy from now. Like, that'll be played forever, you know? Like, if they block 100 shots. And I mean, they literally didn't score at the rim against Klingon, you know? Like,
50 minutes of our life, they did not score. I mean, that's 50 real-time minutes. That's crazy.
Right.
And looking at, so Pringle, a prop that I hadn't really even considered, looking at total rebounds, if Alabama consistently goes smaller, and Pringle's off the court, especially if they get down, you would think you're going to definitely play 5 out. Yeah. Pringle under rebounds is 6.5. So is his rebound total. Under is juiced, but minus 130. It's about what I spent on the VIG that I spent on DR to go over to make a 3. So that's something that's worth a look if you're looking to believe Nate Oates and if Alabama does play 5 out in any sort of scenario here. But really quickly, the player prop that I targeted for this game, I'm not going spread. I'm not going total, even though I debated potentially taking some Alabama 11.5 earlier in the week. I went Mark Sears under. So I got 20.5 points on Wednesday night. It's down to 19.5. I would still play it at 19.5. I make it around 18. And the thought process is, if the game is more so in the half court for Alabama, which I believe it will be, UConn running Alabama off the 3-point line. Yes, Sears, I think, is above the Division I average when it comes to mid-range efficiency, and so is Aaron Estrada, another prop I was considering. But you also then have to factor in Stephon Castle pretty much shadowing Sears every minute he's on the court. We saw Shannon struggle. Some of those struggles were when Illinois was trying to attack the rim against Klingon, but Sears attacking the basket in pick and roll and trying to get to the rim isn't going to work against Klingon either. So unless Alabama is really able to convert on some of those transition opportunities, even off of UConn makes, which we saw them do against Clemson in the second half last week, which really flipped the game when Clemson got back within a possession or two over the final 10, 15 minutes, I expect Castle to hold Sears to 18 points or less. So that's kind of my logic with my prop bet. Castle, one of the best on-ball defenders in college basketball, not a pro-ready offensive prospect in terms of his half-court efficiency, shooting mid-range and above the arc, but really, really good defender, and 6'1", 6'6" frame going up against your 6'1" point guard that hasn't really played this type of physicality. He's played it in the SEC, but actually, that on that point, we saw Sears struggle a lot in that second meeting at Auburn. I know it was at Auburn, and Auburn was pretty much undefeated at home this season, but Denver Jones was one of the better lockdown defenders in that conference, and I consider Castle he's bigger, but more well-rounded defensive player, and Jones was able to stymie him a lot in that first half, which allowed for some Auburn runouts and dominate Alabama in transition. So kind of talking myself into it more, but any thoughts on the Sears under prop from you guys?
Yeah, I like it. Same reasoning. Castle will be shadowing him. And yeah, he has, to say struggled is kind of not the right word, but like against Florida as well. Zion Poland, a very good on-ball defender with a bigger frame, kind of held him to one of his, least efficient SEC games. And something I would tie into that is probably Grant Nelson. Oates running a lot more offense through him. Lots of teams try to attack Caravan. They view him as like the weak league defender on UConn. And so, that'll be Nelson's matchup. And I think that's something Nelson's, diverse offensive game can, back Caravan down. He can take him off the dribble. So I think you'll see a lot more offensive half-court sets designed to exploit that with Grant Nelson and away from Sears.
Yeah, and it's pick your poison with UConn. I mean, they held of their last 8 opponents, they held 7 of them to 33% or less from 3-point range. But if you go inside the 3-point line, the best shooting team was San Diego State, shot 44% from 2. Northwestern shot 41, Stetson 40, and then of course Illinois shooting 25% from 2-point range.
Yeah, San Diego, their offense is geared towards the mid range.
Yeah,
and so that's something they were comfortable with. Alabama is the complete opposite. They completely, shun the mid range. So it's something, so I'm not saying they can't score in the mid-range. It's just something they don't do often. So, it kind of makes sense that San Diego State had the most quote-unquote success in that realm in terms of scoring inside the arc, because that's where they pedal, the mid-range, and Alabama doesn't.
Right.
And going back, one more angle I want to discuss here in a second, but going back to UConn, San Diego State, Ledee kind of looks spooked, especially when UConn made their big run. Not a great first half defensively, but then dominating the second half. Same thing against Illinois. Illinois looked spooked for the first, until the first media timeout, essentially, in that game. But looking at the total in this one, 161.5, pretty much consensus. There are some 160.5 starting to pop, so a little bit of action going in on the under. One variable we haven't touched on in either game is how one or some or all of these teams could be affected by the shooting backdrop that we see from time to time in the NCAA tournament. And if the game is in blowout fashion in UConn's direction, like you guys are betting, or at least Jordan, you're mostly betting on UConn to blow out Alabama. We saw it last year with Miami UConn, a 3-point oriented Hurricanes team. Granted, Alabama has seen the UConn in a sense going back to last season, but different personnel. And the game went under by, I think, around 17, 18 points, and Miami didn't have their best 3-point night, at least juxtaposed to what they shot against Texas down the stretch of that Elite Eight game. So first half under, potentially, until teams get settled. I was looking at that under 76.5. FanDuel has a 77.5 juiced towards the under. Either of you guys interested in picking up a first half under or full game under in this one?
Not really. I have a 158.5 as a raw number, which would be the under in this game, but I can understand why that would climb up. I think a lot of people are anticipating that UConn's going to take control and that Alabama is going to try to hang with them by draining threes, and they're very competent at draining those threes. So I think that's good. It's reasonable for people to say, well, I'm going to take that 158.5 basis and probably kick it up a 3-pointer or two and to get to that 161.5 level. It doesn't surprise me, but it's probably not something that's lucrative enough or something that's going to lure me into betting on it personally.
Yeah, first half under would be a stronger lean for me rather than full game.